Hello and welcome to Alpha Bunga Bunga, the global politics podcast at the end of history. I'm Alex Hochuli, and today we are going to be talking about something that is bang on the money, especially for us. We are talking about the Interregnum, this strange period in which the current neoliberal order hasn't died. It's fatally wounded, but it's not yet been killed. So we're very happy to be joined by Rune Stahl, a postdoc at the University of Copenhagen, to talk about exactly this. His paper on the matter looks back at previous interregnums and looks at how those were negotiated, how competing visions fought over the possibility of creating a new order, and what actually happened. So here is myself, Alex Hochuli, Phil Cunliffe, and George Hoare talking to Rune Stahl. Here's George.
So, Rune, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, so thanks for having me. It's I've been following you for a while, and you're having some really good, some interesting discussions. I really enjoyed the last one here with Quinn Slobodian about neoliberalism. Now we can talk about what's hopefully the end of what they call the beginning of the end. Yeah.
And what comes next? So in your paper that we're mainly going to be discussing today, you compare our periods in many ways to the 1970s, making the case that it's just a time of it's a time of change and transition. And before we dig a bit into more what this idea of an interregnum might mean, I think there are some really important headline points that you make in the argument, in the argument of the paper. And some of these are the following: that it's important that crises or transitionary periods aren't necessarily short. And I think there's often an idea that crises are these short, brief periods between stable periods of rule. And as part of the aim of this podcast, it's important for us to move beyond some of these sterile, inconsistent pronouncements about the death versus the non-death of neoliberalism, with even such a figure as Macron announcing absurdly last December that financial capitalism is nearing its end. And another, starting point here is Antonio Gramsci and his famous quote: "If the ruling class has lost its consensus, i.e. is no longer leading but only dominant, exercising coercive force alone, this means precisely that the great masses have become detached from their traditional ideologies and no longer believe what they used to believe previously," etc. And then comes the famous bit: "The crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear." So I think this is a great starting point for us. So I think one of your main arguments in the paper is that we're in this transitionary period. But does neoliberalism feel like it's in crisis today? Is there that sense of an ending, or is it more just the return of politics?
I think it feels like there is a crisis. It's a part of this is the strength of the left. I think everyone who's been on the left for the last couple of decades have felt the sort of powerlessness, that nothing really worked, and we were the sort of marginality that's basically been here since the 1980s. And that has changed in some ways, but it's also just the lack of confidence of the sort of the high priests of neoliberalism. You got a 2016 paper from the IMF research department talking about neoliberalism oversold. You have the OECD publishing one report after the other talking about inequality. If you go to Davos, like every year they are freaking out about inequality, finance. So there is this sense of basically neoliberalism not being as strong. It's not the sort of uncontested common sense that it used to be. When you see a paper like the 2016 IMF paper, it's not only that they criticize certain neoliberal policies, but it's even that they speak the word. For a long time it was the sort of the go-to defense of any critique of neoliberalism, that it's not a thing. It's just a figment of the imagination. There is no project. Because that worked because it was was basically the only game in town, and that's not the case anymore. And even this, that neoliberals, you can't just say reforms anymore in this sort of broad way, and then everyone nods and what's about that you have to cut benefits and pensions and do austerity. You have to qualify in some ways that saying that it's actually neoliberalism. A lot of centrists are going completely haywire. They really don't like it. It's so I think in a lot of ways you get this feel that the days of complete uncontested common sense is gone from neoliberalism. It's not that it's still it's still there. It's entrenched in all the institutions. It's from the ECB in Frankfurt to the IMF. When they do their policy, it's still nothing has changed in a lot of ways, but it's just the feeling you get, the confidence of the 1990s, the early aughts. That's gone.
That's gone. Yeah. So it's not the only game in town, as you put it. But I think before moving on to talk about some of the ways in which the current period might be more or less similar to the 70s, I think Alex had a question about, are we talking about permanent crisis here, or how did you want to frame that, Alex?
Yeah, well, exactly that. I mean, well, one thing is that, we do have a term for the way that centrists are losing their minds, and we call it neoliberal order breakdown syndrome. So I just want to give a shout out to that. Yeah. But the question of crisis, I mean, I think almost by its nature, it would be wrong to describe something as a permanent crisis or a long-term crisis. I think there's a tendency, I think sometimes on the left, to do this. Like, capitalism's in crisis, it's always in crisis. And the whole point is that there are precisely periods of some sort of equilibrium. And you propose using the term interregnum as opposed to punctuated equilibriums, right? Because those punctuations seem to often be quite long. So I guess, is your work, the article that you've written an attempt to try to flesh out how to treat these periods, which are the in-between periods, basically, the transitionary periods, which often can be quite long?
It's some of this is this sort of inside baseball of academia, where we make a stupid theory and then we can we write 1,000 papers about how it maybe not fits the reality. But I think it's in a lot of ways a lot of the good work on impact of crisis and ideological change, and it's both within the Marxist tradition and broader mainstream institutional theories, is basically based on this idea of critical juncture. That basically systems are stable in most times. You have it. You can call it hegemony, or you can call it whatever you want if you're more mainstream. But it's still this idea that you basically need a crisis to overcome some of the natural stabilizing features of any institutional system. But this also means that you get this idea that development is, I call it the punctuated equilibrium. It's from Stephen Jay Gould, who used it to describe how biological development happens. That is also, you get stability for a long while, and then suddenly something changes quickly. And basically, I think that's been the way that we've thought about this within political economy scholarship, and the way that I've thought about that you have stability, and then you get a crisis, and then you had the post-war order in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s. Then you had a crisis, and then you got neoliberalism, and now we had a crisis. And in some ways, that was also how I started this work. Started looking at sort of comparatively to the 70s. That was this paper was originally part of my PhD I was doing. I started that a couple of years after the crisis, and I was basically just waiting for time to go by so I could do a sort of comparative study of basically how things happened in the 70s and how nothing happened after the 2008 crisis. This was around the time where Colin Crouch had just come out with his book, The Strange Non-Death of Neoliberalism, and everyone was there was, right after the 08 crisis, I guess there was this sort of expectation that we'd see a paradigm shift, that neoliberalism was dead. And once, in 2009 and 10, everyone found out that this wasn't the case, then, everyone was trying to explain this anomaly, basically this surprise that, we've been used to a deep crisis of capitalism, meaning a change in ideology and superstructure. This happened in the 1930s, this happened in the 1970s with the rise of neoliberalism. So, basically nothing changing after the 08 crisis was something that had to be explained. That's why it was this strange non-death. And I was looking at the 70s and saying, okay, what's different? Back then we had change and now there's nothing. But then I started to, it took a while. And when you go back to, if you put yourself in the shoes of someone standing in 1979, which today we see as a sort of the year zero of neoliberalism, I think probably you couldn't see it at the point, or at least very very few people could see it. At that point, you also had like very very strong left movements, and even going
Yeah, no, I mean, just maybe to dig a bit more into this comparison between the 70s and today, and I think in that way to illuminate some of the characteristics of today's period. Phil, I think you had as our very own political throwback, you had some questions about the 70s.
So funny. How am I a political throwback? I don't get it. Anyway,
that'll be a bonus feature. We can come back to that.
the explainer. You'll write the box explainer of.
Well, it was I suppose to push you further along the path of the thinking about what the similarities and differences are with the 1970s, because on the one hand, like you say, there are obvious differences. At the same time, the 70s does seem like a good point of comparison. So I wondered if you could maybe tot up a few of the differences and a few of the similarities for us, kind of in both columns, so we get some sense of an overall kind of perspective.
Just to start with the similarities, perhaps, which is, I guess, more from a left point of view, the good news that basically the 70s was, you had a pretty long period of the old system not really working. And again, you sort of the troubles in the 70s, you could point to 71 with the breakdown of the Bretton Woods system, Nixon taking the dollar off gold, and thereby, just shifting all of the U.S. deficits from the Vietnam War to the rest of the world. You can take like 73 with the first oil shocks, which was where I was sort of normal people really started to feel this turbulence. So in that way, but after that, you had this period of I don't think you would say that it was today we see it, okay, this was like the start of neoliberalism, but at the point, most of the dominant politicians were still thinking in a sort of in a Keynesian way. They were trying to do the same stuff that had worked very well in the 50s and the 60s. In some ways, like a lot of sort of the period of peak Keynesianism in a lot of ways were the 1970s. You had ways of trying to, combine.
That would fit then what you were just saying about the strange non-death of neoliberalism, right? So if the 1970s would have seemed at the time like the strange non-death of Keynesianism, then that would be something similar. They keep on reapplying the same old medicine, even though it no longer fits the disease.
Yeah, and it's and in some ways like it's the same medicine, but it no longer works. It's like it's not doing its job. So in that way, and then you get the sort of the weakening of the ideological, material weakening of this sort of the old consensus, the old center, of course, gives room for alternatives, for the crazies to the left and right. They get their time in the sun. And again, we've had in the last 10 years probably like really good histories of neoliberalism. I think it's we had Quinn Slobodian on who's done like a really good job, and I think we've been better and better at sort of tracing back the trajectory of neoliberalism. But sometimes when we do that sort of very deep historical work, we forget that it was only in the 1970s, and in some ways like pretty late in the 1970s, that these ideas really became central. In some ways, without this prolonged period of crisis and prolonged period of ideological confusion, the Montpellier society would have ended up like so many of the Der Kapital reading groups of the 1970s. It would just been this weird old guys thinking about old ideas. But what happened, of course, was that neoliberalism became successful, and therefore it sort of, I think it is shadowed for sort of understanding the 1970s and in all its complexities. Because if you went back to the time, you had neoliberalism on the right. You had the sort of in the U.S. The conservative movement trying to nominate Reagan in '76, and then being successful in 1980. You had the Thatcherite takeover with Keith Joseph of the Conservative Party, but you also had radicalization on the left, and you had like some of these very again moderate post-war social democratic parties suddenly starting to do some pretty crazy stuff. You had Tony Benn in the UK, who was a very powerful figure with the alternative economic strategy. You had like Mitterrand in France. If you look at for instance, the political program of Mitterrand in '81 that he got elected on, that's like no left party today has anything vaguely similar. But
it's an interesting comparison, because of course he's the one also that transitions to neoliberalism in France effectively when he locks France into the European exchange rate mechanism. I suppose to flip it though, because I take everything you're saying about, and I suppose I'd push the point further, because it wouldn't appear, like you say, it wouldn't have appeared obvious at the time that neoliberalism would be the thing that would emerge successfully. So the real game, or the nub of it then, is to see if it's possible to identify the factors or the trends that are at work at the moment. It's probably too difficult to say which one would emerge successful, but we should at least be able to identify which are those forces and groups that are shaping the current interregnum, right?
Yeah, that's true. And of course, the main difference for us on the left is that in the 1970s we still had a very powerful, very grounded labor movement in most European countries, even to a certain extent in the US. So in that way, it's a harder job today for a left project, for in a lot of ways. And in some ways, I guess that I think most of the renewed power of the left comes from the parliamentary scene. And in the 1970s, that was a very hard arena to play in for the left. It seems in a lot of ways easier today, also because the center left forces are just very weak. But at the same time, having electoral success is only part of a successful political strategy. There's once it comes to actually govern, you need a social base, you need a backing in something else than just just parliament. Otherwise,
right. Yeah. Well, I mean, I wanted to come on to exactly this. I mean, it's interesting because we can make, many interesting comparisons between today's interregnum and that of the 70s. And of course, the 70s, they're living under the shadow of the radicalization of the 60s, the frustration of that, various kind of ways of going beyond the limitations of parliamentary democracy, and that, you find that in expressions even of terrorism, across Europe. But as you say, there were lots of strong social forces, and today we live in a very different period. So I want to maybe change tack and think about how today is precisely different. We're entering clearly into a period of renewed turbulence, both on various national scenes as well as international. But the references that we often reach for to try to explain today seem often kind of inadequate. It's normally the 1970s or the 1930s. So everyone's either like a new Hitler on the scene or is like a failing 1970s style socialist, as centrists like to talk about Corbyn, for example, right? So it might be interesting if we try to spell out what precisely is different about the post-2008 interregnum in contrast to the 70s. Because let me just to say one more thing is that so although you have this kind of, let's say, a cyclical interpretation where you have periods of hegemony, of where you have a certain form of equilibrium, which then gets challenged. You have an interregnum period, and then you have an establishment of a new order. But there's also, across this period since the end of the Second World War, a kind of a secular decline at that same time, right? And it's a secular decline in both in kind of political terms, in terms of parties becoming weaker, social forces becoming less organized, as well as in economic terms, profit rates continually declining, and so on. So that seems to, so as well as the cyclical thing that you described, there's also a secular decline at the same time, isn't there?
I think so, and I think in some ways, it's we are entering not only the sort of the end of the neoliberal period in some ways, but also the end of the post-war period. There's stuff going on that's taking us back to to earlier development. Of course, like these analogies can always take you too far, but I think it's especially the work of someone like Thomas Piketty points to the extent that what we're witnessing now in the sort of the late decadent period of neoliberalism is a return to this to at least when it comes to economic distribution, we're sort of entering a new Gilded Age. So we're not even it's not about going back to the 70s, but more about going back to sort of the pre First World War period.
Well, I mean, a friend of the podcast, Anton Jaeger, made a point in our discussion about the European elections that the main centre left and centre right parties of social democracy and Christian democracy polling under 50% in many different countries and at the European elections was really the definitive end of the post-war period. It was already probably announced a long time ago, but that really right now seems particularly a definitive point of ending of that post-war period.
Yeah, I think that's true. There's also a sort of if we're looking at these sort of long cycles, there's been ever since basically the end of World War II. There's been a steady growth in global integration. Again, part of this was sort of a rebuilding of the earlier period, and it took quite many decades. It was only in the 1970s, 80s that we got up to the same sort of global trade as percentage of global GDP as you had before the First World War. But we also see it kept on growing. We had the era of high globalization with the deeper financial integration that we've ever had before, and it also seems that sort of that's ending in a certain way, or at least it's slowing down. So we no longer have this continual secular growth of global integration, both on sort of in the real economy of commodities being shipped all around the world, and in finance, where again, it's not, finance is still very, very important, and global financial flows are, they're playing a huge role, especially in siphoning off, large part of the world's profits to tax havens. But it's still like we're starting to see the fragility of these, these flows. We're starting to see, that it's, the sort of the confidence it takes to take all of your money and invest them in a very illiquid factory on the other side of the world. You need a very, very high degree of stability, and that needs to be ensured not only by sort of financial institutions, the IMF, the WTO, whatever, but also, of course, of a U.S. Imperial might, military might, guaranteeing these sort of investments. And
So just to no, I think that's absolutely true. The institutional framework that's required for these developments. But just to return once again to the 70s, and to continue this comparison, or maybe to find a point of difference here. Do you think that is it too simple to say that the main distinction or the main difference with the 70s is that at present we still have a real persistence of this kind of Tina-like policy consensus within ruling elite circles in most Western countries, as opposed to the voting public, who seem really to have rejected this sort of centrism in its various forms. Whereas in the 70s, there was in fact quite a lot of strategic disagreement across and within business, civil service, and political personnel at the very top. Do you think this is is it too simple to say this is the main difference between the 70s and today? It's in the nature of the consensus in the ruling bloc, or
no, I actually think there is a large degree of uncertainty and confusion today as well. I think when all the millionaires go to Davos and fuss about inequality and how we need to change the world. Of course, they're cynical and hypocritical and all of these things, but I think they're also, genuinely worried. And I think there is, but the point is just that it's not so easy to, we often have a tendency on the left to think about, ideology and class interest as something being, only going on in the sort of, on the popular front, that it's, the question on, and when it comes to elites, to the ruling class, we just think, well, they have their interest and they know them, but they don't know their interest. They have, they need ideology as well. That's why, that's basically why you need all the economists and the thought leaders and these sort of things. In order to create coordination, cohesion, you do need a certain level of consensus, and when that's gone, you have problems. Also, I think basically a lot of billionaires actually do want a sort of a moderate amount of alleviation of the worst effects of inequality, because it would just be much safer. But they're not able to do it. It's the sort of the mainstream of the business sector in the U.S. They can't control these sort of out of control oligarchs like the Kochs and Sheldon Adelson and who else is running this. It's it's the sort of the mechanisms of coordination is breaking down. I think there's a great book, I can't remember his name, Miss Roach or something, The Fracturing of the American Elite, which is a economic sociologist who looked at these networks of interlocking directorates of big companies, big banks having people sitting in each other's boards, and this sort of network used to be quite tight knit. You had sort of an organization of the commanding heights of the American economy there, but gradually it broke down during the 90s, the 2000s, because basically in the period of early neoliberalism, you had to organize collectively in order for
actually just interesting to touch on that point, and I think Alex has a question on the party form, as he would put it. Just before passing over to him, just to be quite schematic about it, and I guess particularly for listeners who haven't read the paper, there's a really interesting framing that you do, some of the differences between the stabler periods and the interregnum. So and just to frame this discussion about political parties, so you say in a hegemonic equilibrium, that's a $5 phrase for it, but in a stable period you have social forces in a stable block, you have consensus in ideas, institutions are stable, political struggle is about left versus right within a consensus, and political parties seem to be unimportant or tied up within this consensus. But in the interregnum, social forces are in a period of realignment, ideas are in dissensus or disagreement, institutions are unstable, there are several competing hegemonic projects. And then one particularly interesting point that you advance is this idea that political struggle might be within blocks rather than across them within a consensus, and so therefore political parties might become more important as sites of ideological struggle. And this is presented in a very neat table for readers who like that sort of thing, such as me. But just to pass it over to Alex, though, I think, who wanted to put this point about the party form in a more concise way.
Yeah.
Actually, it wasn't so much about the party form, which I do want to come on to, but I think that might end up something which is which is subsequent to what I wanted to ask about, because the question of elite consensus seems a little bit almost paradoxical, because on the one hand, there seems to be an extraordinary amount of elite cohesion because everyone signed up to there is no alternative, and the fundamentals of the economy aren't really under question. At the same time, the ruling classes seem extraordinarily fractious, and you can see in terms of like the government shutdown in the US, and this apparent notion that there's increasing partisanship, increasing bickering, even amongst different fractions of the elite. And so how do we unpick that? What side do we come down on? Are they more are elites today more cohesive or less cohesive than in the past, or in past interregnums? The way I kind of my provisional answer, and I want to hear your thoughts on this, Rune, is that the degree of dissension amongst the elite, within the elite, takes place more on a cultural level than on a political level. And you can see this as, if you see the Democrats and the Republicans in the US, for example, as the two wings of the American ruling class, the divisions there are fundamentally cultural ones. About personal behavior, about how to live your lives, about tastes and attitudes and behavior, and to a certain degree then on certain key, maybe more political questions, but which get interpreted in cultural forms, so what is your attitude, for example, to borders and migration? But in terms of political organization, there seems to be very little dissensus there. So to summarize, to put it briefly, I guess, is the lack of elite cohesion primarily expressed in cultural forms rather than in political ways?
I think the cultural sort of animosities are definitely important. I'm more of a sort of a political economy guy myself, so I have probably less to say, but it's definitely it's there. You can see like also the way that Britain is tearing itself apart in both the left and the right over Brexit. It's very, very hard to fit that into a sort of any sort of economic interest debate. So that's definitely, and especially also in the 1970s, you can't understand the rise of neoliberalism in the U.S. context, especially without understanding the backlash against the civil rights movement, which again was a sort of largely cultural event. So I think you're right there that definitely plays a role, and I think a lot of the sort of again, when I think I start to see, differences also on the sort of economic side of it, it's because, some of this cultural stuff also has economic consequences. What you feel about sort of immigration and openness has, also has pretty large economic consequences. The sort of, the movement of people and, around the world, around Europe, which has played a large role in the sort of the right-wing cultural backlash of the last couple of years. That's of course very, very closely tied to the project of neoliberal globalization, and you can see that that again, whether or not this is part of a planned project or not, if Trump is actually successful in stopping the flow of commodities of goods from China, and this will have huge consequences for the whole build-up of value chains and the whole structure of the American economy. So it will have there is spillover also between these areas, but I think you're right. The elite, the right is deeply divided by these cultural questions. The problem here, of course, being that this is the case for the left as well. The sort of the bind that the Labour Party in the UK is in. That basically it's split down the middle on the issue of Brexit. It's very hard, because I think it's also it's hard for the left to win on any of these cultural war questions. Whether or not they are. Yeah.
This sets up really nicely the question that I passed over to Alex, or maybe I just should have passed over to myself to ask this question, which is about that's good sharing, right? Which is about political parties and this idea that they become relatively more important in an interregnum. They become sides of ideological struggle. Certainly seems to be true in the UK, at least. But this runs counter, or actually, this is the question: does this run counter to the analysis given by Peter Mayer and many others on the left about the hollowing out of the party form? Or is it precisely that we're seeing this situation where you would expect parties to become more important and sides of ideological struggle, but in fact they've been, in many cases, hollowed out? So you see this being filled up with all of the cultural dissensus that you just previously were talking about.
I do think that we are seeing parties taking on a new centrality. Again, if we go back to the 1970s, then it was the big changes taking place with the rise of neoliberalism was not so much about again the change of government necessarily. You had in the UK, you had the Heath government, you had Nixon proclaiming that we're all Keynesians now. The big change taking part during the 1970s was the takeover, very sort of as a grassroots movement in the US in a lot of ways by the sort of Goldwater conservatives running Reagan as an outsider. And sort of trying to take over and throw out the old East Coast moderate elite in the Republican Party. In the UK, it was more of a more gradual, but it basically Thatcher and Keith Joseph coming in and transforming the Conservative Party from being this relatively moderate, post-war. You had a lot of center-right parties, building welfare states, in the 60s and 70s. De Gaulle in France, the CDU in Germany. So a lot of what really happened in the 1970s was the transformation of these parties. And of course, with the paradigmatic example here, of course, is Corbyn's Labour and sort of the struggle going on in the Democratic Party in the US at the moment. Other places you see the complete collapse of the center left, and sort of some places the left rising to take over. Sometimes it's just like in France now, sort of chaotic. But it's more of the realignment within. It's the sort of the end of this shift between center right, center left. You get then you get a Blair, then you get a Major. So it's the differences aren't perhaps that big, but it's in the last couple of years, party politics has suddenly become crucial in another way. And to turn towards Peter Mayer's, which of course I admire his work tremendously. When I call this paper "Ruling the Interregnum," it is sort of an homage to his "Ruling the Void," which I've been very inspired by. But in some ways, this is saying that it has been a development, but it's also a development of neoliberalism, of basically a feeling by a lot of people of it doesn't really matter who you vote for, nothing really changes, and the sort of zooming out of politics. But we are seeing, at least among the young cohorts, sort of plugging into politics again. Yeah. Of course, it has a different form than it used to in the post-war period, where you had like real mass parties. But we have like video games and TV and what's going on now. So there's things aren't as boring as they were in the 1950s, where you join the youth wing of a political organization just to go to a party. So there's like sociological stuff going on, but on a political level,
that's the different party form.
Now everyone listens. Now everyone listens to podcasts.
Yeah,
that's true. Which is the highest form of politics.
Yeah, the podcast form is important in contemporary politics, and undoubtedly. I think Alex though had a question about what comes next. Are we monsters of the interregnum? Just
before that, though, I wanted to. So if you could tell us, Rune, then what you would identify as the key, if you could just list the key agents or the key kind of forces at work that we would need to keep an eye on, and which we could reasonably expect that one of them will emerge as the dominant tendency of the next 30 years?
Oh, that's a big question. It's the prediction game here is hard. Also, like if 5 years ago anyone had told me that the UK would be
not to predict who will win, only to identify who's contending.
Yeah, but even that, I think a large part of what's happening now is basically sort of it's more, I think, a loss of cohesion, a lot of strength from the political establishment, and less the case of the left suddenly being very strong again. The Corbyn story is, I think, indicative here. It's no one, least of all, like people on the British left. I lived in London in 2011 to 12, and again a bit later. And I went to lots of left talks, and I was even a bit involved in Left Unity at that point. And everyone had just written off Labour, everyone had written off the Labour left, and suddenly it's just the sort of the rot meant inside of the Labour Party meant that it was just like it collapsed completely. But the same with the US. No one could have predicted again, just 5 years ago, that we'd have a democratic socialist running there would probably, tip the Anglo countries to being, the last place where we'd have, a potentially victorious hegemonic left formation. And on the other hand, a place like France, I would have thought that, with the amount of turbulence, with the sort of you've had the sort of lots of like false starts, and we thought with Mélenchon last time he had a shot. So that nothing had happened in France, for instance, has surprised me quite a lot in this left resurgence so far. So. Yeah, but basically it's. But perhaps your question was more on sort of the sort of the building blocks of was it more on the sociological level? Who will be the new revolutionary vanguard?
These social forces in realignment. I think this is what Phil was digging into. Who are these forces? But I mean, maybe to move.
Yeah, but I think it's a hard question, and I'm basically more of a again an elite guy. I can tell you why they're fucking up and don't know what they're doing, whereas the sort of the more the social movement dynamic that we have now is it's a lot more it's fluid. Seems to move faster than it used to.
Just as an aside, sorry, I just wanted to make a quick aside, because you made the comparison between the Anglo countries, which seem to have this a certain political energy on the left, and then comparing it to France. And it's actually funny because in France you actually do have a social movement in the form of the Gilets jaunes, which finds no political expression, and then in the Anglo countries you have a political movement which doesn't really have too much of a social base.
Yeah, that is true. Yeah, and then the question is, what is the most, what's the most, what's the nicest to have, basically, in the long run? Because I think also in a lot of ways, part of this, of course, is also, part of this is, just like the establishment collapsing in of itself. But I think it's also a sort of, at least on an intellectual level, a wising up on the left. I think if we'd still have the early 2000s anti-globalization movement, not wanting to take power, we'd still be milling about, perhaps doing some demonstrations. But I think there's been a sort of a re-evaluation of basically how important state power is, how that has to play a role. In some ways, this has basically been sort of a real-time. As in real-time learning experience, as in Spain, where sort of Podemos grew out of the M15 movement. Of course, like Podemos, is perhaps not as strong as they were a couple of years ago, but they're still, you managed to shake up the system by entering electoral politics.
So, so you mentioned previously elites fucking up and the establishment collapsing in on itself. To return, I guess, just briefly to this Gramsci quote that we started with, what are these morbid symptoms? Where do you see this great variety of morbid symptoms as occurring in 2019?
Yeah, I think I touch on a lot of the sort of the ideological ones. The sort of this feeling of panic, lack of cohesion, lack of this sort of easy confidence of early 90s neoliberals. But I think there's also, if we look at the sort of the more material level, that we've been basically running again the austerity wave of the 2000s was sort of in some ways neoliberalism on speed. It was drastic reductions in welfare in a lot of countries. This flexibilization of the labor market, meaning making it easier to hire and fire, all of these things, and it's just it hasn't had the effect. We're running this unorthodox monetary policy where we're running basically an interest rate of 0, even pumping out money directly into the financial system. And even when you're doing all of this, and we're probably at the peak of a boom right now, just before another sort of crash, and still, you can barely manage to squeeze out 2% growth in most developed economies. So it's like, it's like you have the engine is running, you have your foot on the speeder all the way down, and you're still only going 20 miles an hour. It's it is it's basically trying to do the same things, but they just don't work as well as they used to. Again, the same with the sort of Keynesian demand management of the 1970s. You try to stabilize the economy and do this sort of relatively inclusive growth, the non-inflationary growth that you've done in the 50s and 60s, and you're just unable to do it. And of course, all of this tells us that it's capitalism is an unstable system, and sometimes with either brains or luck, it just you get a certain alignment of forces where certain instruments works for a while, but
so then there's in this situation there's a search for new ideas and for competing visions. But I think, Alex, you had a point there about what these competing visions seem to offer us.
Yeah, I mean, it was quite stark, because when you put it in a table, as you do in your article, it does stand out quite starkly. I mean, so you do a table of kind of the 1970s interregnum, where, as well as the rising neoliberal challengers and the kind of continuity Keynesianism, you also have a more radical left approach, which is in the form of Mitterrand or the Labour's 1983 manifesto, which gets defeated. And so you have a similar sort of format for today's situation, where you have austerity neoliberalism, which is, again, kind of continuing to do the same thing with decreasing returns, as you've just described. And then you have an economic nationalism, which is challenging that. And then you have a left populism. But, I mean, reading it struck me like how limited these visions actually are, how little of a real alternative they seem to be. Because the economic nationalism, I mean, beyond the question of trade and then of migration, the differences seem to be more in the rhetorical or discursive level, that they say things that you're not meant to say. But in material terms, in many ways, that what they propose is a continuity of neoliberalism. It's putting neoliberalism into a more nationalist jacket, but in fundamental terms, it doesn't change very much. And you can look at different examples, Orban in Hungary, for that matter, or Erdogan in Turkey, and it doesn't seem to be any great divergence from past forms of rule.
And I would just add to that, though, as well, like Syriza in Greece, right?
Well, right.
I mean, that's been the lesson, is that the party that destroyed PASOK, and that was, pacification was what everyone was talking about on the left, or Aaron Bastani was anyway, a couple of years back. The result has been it was Syriza that wielded neoliberal austerity in Greece. So it's not just its pictures aren't just on the left.
So let me just to finish the point that I was making. I mean, do we not have, as like the interregnum that we have now? I mean, and the competing visions which rush in seem to be more, again, still on a cultural or ideological level than a material one so far.
I would say in a lot of ways, yes. But I think there's also, I think there are potential economic consequences. And again, for me, it's a matter of, neoliberalism just isn't working. Something needs to arise, of course. And, it might be me being too, rational here, saying, someone needs to come up with a solution, and that might not be what people are looking for at the moment. But I think there are, at least when it comes to left to the left, I think we are actually seeing signs of more transformative visions. At least I think the main part here is the reemergence of the issue of ownership. Of course, with the new models of ownership proposal from Labour 2017, and Bernie Sanders in the US also starting to talk about it in Denmark, where I said it's also sort of re-emerged after a complete hiatus. And of course, I think that is, that points us to again where the 1970s started to become radical again. Especially here in Scandinavia, we had the sort of the peak of Scandinavian social democracy was the sort of the campaign in the 1970s, both in Denmark and Sweden, for wage earner funds, and this was basically you had like these very, very moderate social democratic parties who'd all very, very pro-US campaign for joining NATO, and suddenly they were by the grassroots being they had to at least campaign for policies to take over the means of production, and the issue of ownership has been completely kept out of the agenda ever since. And I think the emergence there can be quite powerful, also because the right just they haven't got a clear line on this issue. All their guns are basically trailed on the government and taxes. The rhetorical trick of the neoliberals was basically turning the debate of socialism versus capitalism into a debate of more or less state. And this also means that they are completely unable to counter left proposals that aren't about tax and spend policies, but are actually about changing systems of ownership. Of course, once you start to do this, things start to get hairy. People will capital is not just a factor of production. It can bite, and I think it probably will bite if this ever you actually see some of these policies put into place. But I think it is actually indicative of the sort of the left populists now not only being or sort of new left formations, not only being old social democrats. I think they are at least social democrats in in the sense of actually wanting to change basic economic structures of societies. So I think at least when it comes to that, it's it is new stuff are emerging. But of course, you're right in pointing out that if you look at just like the programs, the Corbyn program of 2017, the last Podemos election manifesto, what Jean-Luc Mélenchon has run on in France, it's programmatically very, very moderate. But yeah.
No, I think that's a good sort of note of moderation and realism to finish on. And thanks so much for your time, Rune. And I think the discussion today has been extremely useful, sort of making some of these points around the current moment that we're in, and a bit beyond just this idea that we've just come a long way from 2008, and Corbyn is a miracle, a failure maybe, but a miracle nonetheless, which you sometimes see trotted out and don't really engage with some of the complexities.
Mirage, of course, not just a
miracle. But it's still a miracle. It still comes out. It might be an oasis in a desert, which proves to be a mirage, but it's still an oasis in the desert. And so,
as you can see, Rune, we have some disagreements within our hegemonic. We have some hegemonic and counter-hegemonic
the correct desert metaphor.
Well, it's the end of history, so you have Corbyn might fail, but I think we might need to go through that failure till we find something else that might have capacity to succeed.
But I think it's worth thinking about that the left for a long period we haven't even gotten to the level of failing. It's
no, that's right. The
left of the early 2000 didn't even fail. The left of in 2008 we didn't even fail. We didn't
it didn't even turn up. You didn't. Yeah, you can be beaten 7-1, but
no idea. And now at least we have prospects of
failure.
of coming in and filling, and Comrade Tsipras has shown us it's that's the sky's the limit when it comes to
This is actually a great note to finish on.
Yeah, what a note to finish on. We now have prospects for failure. So thank you so much, Rune, for coming on.
Thank you.
Cheers.